all for your patience. We appreciate that. Welcome to session 1C, Fixity and Mid-Adversity, Core Sound Waterfowl Museum and Heritage Center Oral History Collection, a climate change case study. I'd like to introduce our speakers for this session. First, Michelle Witt works for the State Archives of North Carolina. In addition to her work for the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum and Heritage Center, she has served as an archives consultant for Adam Matthew Digital, the Loophole Foundation, and the Winthrop Group. Karen William Amspacher.
That's me.
Is the director of the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum and Heritage Center. She earned a bachelor's degree in education from Appalachian State University, completed graduate coursework at East Carolina University, and worked as an educator in Buncombe and Craven County schools. Max Cawley is joining us virtually today. Max is the Director of Climate Research and Engagement for the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, North Carolina, and the Director of the Center for Collaborative Heat Monitoring. He also serves as a co-principal investigator for the Carolinas Collaborative for Climate Health and Equity, and as an adjunct instructor in Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy. Finally, Layne Hinton. Tara Hinton received a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from UNC Chapel Hill earlier this month. She served as an editor-in-chief of the Health Humanities Journal in 2024 through 2025. In addition to interning for the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum, she has worked for the Southern Oral History Program and completed vegetation surveys of North Carolina's maritime forests. Please join me in welcoming them to this panel.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction, Josh. And thank you all for joining us today. Let me make sure the clicker is still working. Clicker is not working. Okay. I guess I'm going to be going like that. Okay, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we gather today on the ancestral lands of the Pamlico, Tuscarora, and Lumbee peoples who have stewarded this land for generations. We recognize their deep connection to this land and the historical injustices they have faced. By way of introduction to the people of Harkers Island in down east North Carolina, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the places themselves. The Core Sound Waterfowl Museum and Heritage Center is on Harkers Island. Those of you who are local to eastern North Carolina may already know where Harkers Island is. I like to tell people that it is south of the southernmost point of the Outer Banks, and it is about 2 hours from here. Though I'm going to talk a great deal about Harkers Island, the collecting scope of the museum centers on down east Carteret County, which consists of all points east of the North River Bridge on US 70 and the Core Sound, which encompasses Cape Lookout National Seashore and its surrounding waters. The collection also captures the history of a number of communities that no longer exist. This map is of Shackelford Banks, just south of Harkers Island. In the 19th century, it was home to several communities, and residents of these communities were forced to abandon their homes and move inland after the 1899 San Siriaco hurricane. Diamond City is the most often mentioned community, but as you can see here, there are several. Let's step back in time a little bit further. Harkers Island's original inhabitants were members of the Cawley tribe, a very small tribe that lost many of its people in the Tuscarora War. The remaining natives were most likely absorbed by the Tuscarora Nation. The Core Sound and the Core Banks take their name from the Cawley people. The island was purchased by Ebenezer Harker in 1730. Harker was believed to be a cousin of Benjamin Franklin, and he came from Massachusetts to establish a plantation and get involved in the whale oil trade. Even though commercial whaling is no longer legal, this was the foundation for generations of people who have made their living on the water. Because for a very long time, the only way to reach the mainland was by boat, change happened very slowly. However, with the arrival of electricity and shortly after that, the first bridge change and growth on Harkers Island abruptly accelerated. People who remember life before these modern conveniences felt a strong pull to capture and preserve life on Harkers Island as it once was. That was a life that was molded by hard work, self-sufficiency, and very strong traditions of faith and family. Harkers Island is also home to a unique dialect. People often ask if it is akin to the Ocracoke dialect, and it is, but Harkers Island also has a unique vocabulary to accompany this dialect, which you can read more about in this cookbook, which was published in the late 1980s. For those of you who love cookbooks, and I know a lot of archivists who do, I think this one is a little bit special because it is a lot more than recipes. It really is kind of the first formal history of Harkers Island. It has a lot of stories about generations of its inhabitants, and it also has a glossary for people like you and me to understand what Harkers Islanders are saying. For example, people who are not from Harkers Island, who are referred to as being from off, are called dit daughters or dingbatters. So everyone in this room, Karen accepted, is probably a dit daughter or a dingbatter. So as a result of this desire to preserve local history, oral histories really took root long before the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum was established. The first recordings in the collection were captured in 1969, and the first formal program began just a few years later when the National Park Service assumed ownership of Cape Lookout. And the people who lived there were forced to move inland. Literally dozens of oral histories capture the tension between locals and the National Park Service and other outsiders who saw opportunities in the changes taking place at the coast. During this time, Karen Amspacher had left Harkers Island to attend college. She returned to marry and raise a family, and she answered the call to support and celebrate the community in which she grew up. The cookbook was just the start. She really had something much bigger in mind. And today, the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum and Heritage Center is a 24,000 square foot facility that hosts countless community events and educational programs. It partners actively on a daily basis to address climate change in its communities. As you can see, several rooms, community galleries that celebrate the individual communities that make up Down East. And the library that you see here is also home. There's a door at the back to the research room, and that is where archivists, community historians, and interns do their work. So why is oral history so important here? I think it's telling that a place where people value independence and self-sufficiency would have an affinity for a form of historical capture that relies on people's own voices telling their story their way. Oral history, as opposed to a standard interview, also is structured in order to serve the purpose of long-term preservation. So someone 50 or 100 years from now can not only access it, but understand its content and its value. To give you a bit of an idea of the scope and content of this collection, it includes firsthand and secondhand recollections of a variety of significant events, including the Chrissy Wright shipwreck, which happened just off the coast of Cape Lookout, the San Ciriaco hurricane, which was one of the first events clearly documenting the impact of climate change on this region. The oral history program gained momentum at a time when many people who had come of age during the 1930s could share clear recollections of that time. And interestingly, they say the Depression didn't really have a major impact on them because they were accustomed to making do with very little. The Depression did, however, bring jobs, as well as new roads and other infrastructure, and the opening of Marine Corps Cherry Point. It was a watershed moment in providing opportunities for a living away from the coast. You saw the photo earlier in the presentation of the hurricane of 1933. To Downeasters, that's not ancient history. They may remember that specific hurricane, but they also deal with hurricanes like it on an ongoing basis. Ask them whether they see a connection between changes in the environment and changes in their ability to make a living on the water. You're going to get really complicated answers. It's a complicated question. Oral histories that center on the 1997 Fisheries Reform Act illustrate their resentment toward the government for making it harder for small fishermen to actually make a living. And then the closure of Beaufort Fisheries, that was a major employer in the region. And when that went away, that was truly the mark, the end of one era and the beginning of another. So how can a museum support oral history over the long term when it's constantly hard at work dealing with natural disasters? Karen in particular deserves credit for playing the long game. She has built countless partnerships, she has secured grants, and she has embraced the enthusiasm of community members who want to keep conversations going. This is a community archive in the absolutely truest sense of the term. And while people like me have contributed to the collection's long-term preservation, it's people's willingness to talk that gives this collection its substance and its enduring value. Sorry. That's a technical glitch.
One slide.
Can I
Go ahead
click out of
and
this?
Share computer audio,
Okay,
because don't think they would be able to hear it virtual without doing it.
got it. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. The juggling act is real.
You're doing great.
Thanks. Okay. The collection encompasses a wide and growing variety of topics, many of which I have already talked about here. The numbers in this overview are intentionally vague as the collection is open. New oral histories are being conducted every year, and there are closed series that haven't even been accessioned yet. But instead of continuing to tell you about the collection, I want to invite you to listen to some voices from the past.
The history down east for its first decades of people living here and longer was an oral tradition. It was much like the Native Americans. Even in my lifetime, I grew up before I started first grade, we lived with my grandmother, who had kerosene lamps and a pot-bellied coal heater in the house. In the kitchen was a 4-burner kerosene stove and oven. And there was no TV. So at night, before we went to bed, people sat and actually talked to each other.
That's right. Yeah.
And there'd always be a comment, well, do you remember the time that Uncle so-and-so did? Or when the sound froze over, or when the horse penning happened, you know. So I grew up learning a lot about my place and neighbors and relatives from hearing my grandmother and father and mother and whoever else happened to be, and just having conversations.
Right.
Because they would give us the little girls back then. My girlfriend Claire Ann Wiggins and I would get the old Sears Roebuck catalogs and a pair of scissors, and we entertained ourselves for months cutting out paper dolls out of the Sears and Roebuck catalog. But while we were doing that, we would be listening, absorbing what the adults were saying. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing that's missing now. And I'm guilty. I wish we had had the time or had taken the time to sit down and just talk about people and places like my grandparents did or my grandmother did.
There were so many people whose lives were wrapped up in the menhaden industry. Mm-hmm. The grocery stores that serviced the boats, the people who owned the railways that the boats were pulled up on when they needed to be repaired, and such as Barber's Marine Supply, it was called. The places, the stations that that fueled the boats, the crews on the boats, the captains on the boats, and there were not early on, but later on, and as more factories were built, it was a huge industry. There was probably not many families in town who were not affected some way, one way or another.
With making a net, you do it like a pattern, just like as if it was a dress you were cutting out piece by piece and sewing together. That's the way you make nets. They have come out with different patterns, different styles through the years. One was thought to do better than another, and seems like that does for a while, and then they'll change back or go to something else. But probably right straight through, I think when they come out with the polyethylene, using that over the nylon, because it fishes so much cleaner and you don't have to treat it, I think that's probably as much of a plus as anything. And then, of course, when they come out with a knotless polyethylene that didn't have the knots, so you could pull the nets through the water so much faster and they fish cleaner, I think that was a major plus.
What do you think the future of your craft is?
I honestly think the future of my craft is on a dead end. I think it's a dying heritage. I think that one by one, as the commercial fisherman gets out of it and has to go do something else in order to make a living, eventually there will be no need for a net shop. If you don't have fishermen, you don't need a net shop.
I do distinctly remember there was a fairly substantial flooding event in October, and there was no hurricane associated with it. We just had like a week-long spell of rain where it rained like 10, 20 inches inland. And about 2 weeks later, it happened to be full moon, and it happened to be blowing northeast, and it's like all the water come out the rivers, pushed down the sound, and it was neap tides or neap tides anyway on the moon cycle. And there was a week probably straight for at least 4 days that every day the roads in Marshallburg was flooded, all on the eastern side.
But then you'll find Brady Lewis's influence around Harkers Island in this area is more on Harkers Island. His influence is, you can see more on Harkers Island than it is in Davis or Marshallburg or one of those other communities. Yet he had an influence. The Flare Bow is in all of those locations. But he tended to make some of his joinery work different from some of the other builders, and therefore anybody who worked with him or was taught by him kind of picked up on that difference. So if you really study it community by community, somebody who lived in that community and worked with 2 or 3 different boat builders would probably be able to say, I don't know who built it, but it came from Marshallburg, you know.
Joyful, but it's fun. If you love the Lord, you love the one you're singing about, and I think singing itself, we were brought up with that. Children were in the evenings, we sat out on our porches and people would sing. Just sit out on the porch, sing, or in the children playing. It was a tool we played with. It was something that we had, and you didn't have to have books. We didn't have a problem if the funeral was held in a home and the singers stood over the casket or out on the porch. You sang whether you had the music or not. You get together and sing, because that was a tradition. That was a talent. That's the way it was. and we have grown into higher heights and deeper depths in music. But I still appreciate looking back and thinking how the Lord blessed this community in that way. How she could sit down and tear a piano up and didn't know a note in the world, I don't believe. It was all natural and hard to explain.
You sang it on it. This way, that way, to the gate they run, they're coming off the adventure. Put the
It's not supposed to do that.
chicken on the bum. Some of them lost religion and back could lie the poor. But King Lock Stopper stood ace high when the booze outrun ashore. Every morning, night, and they'd go down to meet to see what the Harkers Island would meet, to see what was going on. And it's the same tune, but different words. And Sanders over here played the piano. And he drilled all the people, every cove when they went, drilled the island people. And he beat drums every time he cut a younger down a drill. And Ivy he put the words to it, he and Ivy, and played it to dance it. And Ivy played it. And Ivy took up one time to the judge and said Sunday school's going to miss and everything. And he took his fiddle and he said there's tears in that there. He was a Christian. There's tears in that there judge's eyes. So go on back and play your fiddle.
With the 95 freeze, I was a Pambacola and we camped over to the south of Indian Island. I remember we were sticking stakes when that freeze struck out the back of Indian Island, out north of Indian Island in the channel, you know, Chadnet. And when that struck, man, I had good clothes on, oil clothes, boots, and it went right on to the skin.
Papa, was that the Chrissy Wright freeze?
No, Chrissy Wright freeze was before that.
You remember the Chrissy Wright freeze?
No, I was just a kid then, I think.
Uh-huh.
I don't remember much about the Chrissy Wright freeze.
But I understand cold weather is sort of compared today. A person will say it's cold as Chrissy Wright time.
Yeah.
Well, that Chrissy Wright, that's how you get fooled in weather sometimes. You can't know how to comprehend it. They come in there and it was just as peaceable as it could be. They landed anchored and then the wind struck in the southwest. It blew just terrible. And they went in for a day, in the middle of the night, went in the northwest, went to freezing. And freeze sure enough. And they wrapped up in all the sails, and then part of it being frozen dead.
Jeez. Did they try to send any boats out to the Chrissy Wright?
They couldn't get the boats to right then.
Jeez.
They got so bad. You were watching all over the three masters, the little old boats couldn't get there. But the men over on Shackleton's bank went in and built a fire on the beach. It was just maybe 200-300 yards off in the water.
Oh, jeez.
And they said that was the prettiest sight they ever saw, and sorrowful to know. So I was far plenty of it, and they couldn't get ashore.
So what's at stake here? I see this as a twofold challenge. The loss of community memory would be a blow to the local identity. And the local identity isn't a single identity. Each community down east has its own history and traditions and identity based on the specific values and marine trades that are practiced there. Some communities are known for boat building, some for shrimping, some for net making. There's the stories of the ferry captains, the bridge tenders, the Coast Guard employees, the teachers, the religious elders. When you layer in the impact of climate change, it's a whole different dimension. The effects of that are something we as archivists are dealing with every day, consciously or subconsciously. However, these communities also face to some degree or another the possibility of the same fate of their ancestors. They are direct descendants of the people who left Cape Lookout and Shackleford Banks because of rising water. Where they live now, they constantly are guarding against flooding and wind damage. They don't want their communities to be erased, physically or intellectually. Oral history is one very important way that they can keep that from happening. So how are we doing? In 2023, I was contracted to assume stewardship of the oral history collection, and I set to work organizing material gathered by numerous community historians and interns over the previous 50 plus years. Some of the work is very basic, just finding missing assets, standardizing file formats, transcribing work. Metadata creation and remediation are probably the most difficult part of that work. And I would say that the principles of conscious description that we exercise with other marginalized communities are important here as well. Additionally, digital storage is probably the biggest obstacle to public accessibility. I am happy to say, however, if I can go forward instead of back. Number one, the museum was fortunate enough to be able to quickly process its summer 2024 oral history series. It's called Down East Change. It's available on the Core Sound website. And to me, it's kind of one of the best collections yet because it's a mix of old folks and young folks really explicitly talking about climate change in very concrete, practical terms. And so I feel like that was its own success. Additionally, there is a migration underway to Past Perfect Web Edition. Past Perfect is the museum's collection management system. And previously it was not cloud-based. And so trying to find appropriate digital storage and hosting to ensure that people can access transcripts and audio recordings was an uphill climb. Past Perfect Web is going to solve for that. This leap forward in digital accessibility will fundamentally close the distance between Down East and the rest of the world by engaging people in the conversation about global warming, regardless of where they are geographically, as well as fostering what I think is a greater appreciation for Down East's unique contributions to American history, and also celebrating the things that we share as humans. Partnerships are the lifeblood of this work, and the work continues regardless of what's happening at the national level. The Down East Resilience Network in particular is bringing together scientists, community leaders, creative producers, educators, and many, many more people to address in real time the dilemma of climate change in struggling communities. Their work is made possible by so many people, the ones you see here, and many more. And so with or without oral history, this work would probably take place, but oral history gives it a human face. Oral history is the foundation for its development. It's the seed of inspiration. And so with that, I would really love to turn the microphone over to my co-presenter, Tara, to talk a little bit more about her experience conducting oral histories in Down East, North Carolina.
Oops. Oops. All right, beautiful. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that overview, wonderful overview of the archives. I think that's one of the best that you're going to get. So today I want to talk with you a bit about oral history as a process. We talked about oral history in the archives with Michelle, but oral history as a process between the community and the academy, right? It is a way in which people who are outside of the community, like myself, can work with the community, right, to create these living documents, to create a working relationship that hopefully we hope is less exploitative than traditional research methods that are kind of in and out, fly-by-nighter research groups. So in the summer of 2023 and 2024, the Core Sound Museum got me on board to work with the Down East Change Project that Michelle has told you all about, and facilitated the creation of 12 oral histories with Down East residents. With their support, this work turned into an undergraduate honors thesis trying to understand the relationship between community well-being and this environmental change that Down East is facing. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that today and what I learned from being immersed in the community. So, as I said before, there are lots of benefits to doing oral history with communities. In sitting down with community members to talk about their lived experience, as interns, like myself, we develop partnership and shared ownership of knowledge. In particular, with the Core Sound Museum's process of doing oral histories, we always give back transcripts to our narrators. So this sort of facilitates a shared ownership. It gives back people a document that they can share with family members, friends, etc. So it's a little bit more collaborative. Second, I experienced a lot of cultural immersion as an intern. This went from going on shrimping boats to see how fishing worked, but ultimately sitting down in people's homes and discussing their lives with them turned into friendships, essentially, and a lot more than oral history. So that's the second lesson from doing oral history with communities. And third, when we work with communities to do oral histories, we build our empathy as researchers and expand our flexible thinking, right? When you sit down and talk about someone's lived experience, you go in with some assumptions always, but especially people down east will break you out of those assumptions. And so that's one thing that I experienced is hearing about their history, their cultural heritage. My worldview was completely expanded. And I think that's one of the benefits as well. And fourth, better understanding of community history hopefully makes research more compatible to community needs. Oftentimes, we know that researchers go in without a clear understanding of what communities really want and what they need. And when we sit down and talk with community members, we lay the foundation for better research that is meeting their wishes, their desires, their hopes for the future. And that's incredibly, incredibly important. So, I want to return to the question of climate change down east that Michelle introduced. Here's what we learned with the Down East Change Project from doing oral histories with Down East residents. The first lesson is that oral history privileges the everyday events and the everyday people, sometimes even over extraordinary events like hurricanes. But this means that our discussions with community members about climate change are grounded in their experiences and their histories. This can make discussions about environmental change more legible to both the research community and the residents. So, oral history is grounding difficult, sometimes abstract conversations. That's the first lesson. The second takeaway was that oral histories told us that the issues academics are often concerned about, like forest loss and sea level rise, felt more secondary to the communities. Overdevelopment, isolation, and loss of heritage felt like far more urgent matters in some cases. So, what this tells us is that heritage-sensitive ways of adapting to environmental change will be important for communities, And this makes oral history, I believe, a path forward to bridge researchers and communities looking for ways to hold on while letting go. Thank you all very much for listening, and I want to thank the Core Sound Museum for letting me stay in Down East for a while. All right, and then turning it over next to Max Cawley.
Do you want to transition for him, or do you want me to do the transitions?
Sure, go ahead. I know the slides less if you'd like to do the transition.
Yeah, then I'll pause.
There he is.
Max, you should now be a presenter.
Amazing. Hey, y'all. Thank you so much. Really good to see all of y'all and wish I was down there with you. I don't see the slides up currently, but I can see them in the image that Michelle and Tara are in right now, so I can get started using that.
We do up, so you're good to go. Just tell me when to forward them.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that works. So I'm here to talk just a few minutes about something that Michelle talked about earlier, which is ensuring that the research that is occurring about climatology or flooding or geology or geography that occurs in Down East also has a human element. And one of the very best ways that we understand to do that is by taking as deep a dive into the rigorous science that is being done about coastal phenomena, for example, in Down East, that we can take so deep of a dive into understanding the local history and the stories that people tell, so that researchers who are doing that work in Down East aren't taking only a surface level understanding of the really complex history and dynamics of the place, and are carefully considering the implications of their work on the people that live there. The incredible resources that have been mentioned so far are a really, really important asset, not only for the general public, but also for scientists and researchers who are working towards understanding climate change and the implications of climate change on the people who live Down East. So let's take a little bit of a look at how we contextualize that and how we make use of some of these resources. You can go to the next slide, Michelle. So storytelling in this dynamic is an appropriate vessel, and perhaps more appropriate a vessel, for understanding the human experience of climate change in a few different ways. One of the ways that we can directly use this is by ensuring that the climate research that is being done is not only validated, but is coincident alongside understanding how people have experienced some of these phenomena. In many other cases, climate science fails in very rural, very remote places that have not been reached by expert science or their tools for a really long time in the past. And so instead, the tools of understanding through anecdotal evidence and evidence that exists in these archives are some of our best understanding of events that have occurred in the past, or of small events that have had very large implications for people that live Down East. In these ways, storytelling and the stories that exist in this archive are actually acting as a climate archive for us. They act as some of our very best understanding of some of these events and how people experience them. You can move to the next slide.
I realized I needed you to do that again so that everyone on.
Are we good now?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, y'all. So what I'm talking about is slightly different than what Tara talked about. Rather than conducting a whole bunch of new oral histories in the way that Tara has been describing, which is incredibly important work for ensuring that we are collecting the stories and evidence of how people are experiencing change, one of the ways that we are using the archive currently is by looking through the archive to examine it for evidence of how people have experienced change in the past. We do this through a blended model of inductive and deductive thematic coding, meaning you can examine a bunch of individual stories across a whole huge array of themes for questions like what do you see, which tells us about observed changes to relationships to the land, what is changing, which tells us about some of the observed climate impacts, and then what do you hope, things about people's values and priorities for the future. You can go to the next slide. Across all of this, there are a huge amount of questions that we as social scientists or we as archivists can ask ourselves as we are looking through all of these different pieces of evidence about how people are experiencing the really complicated interplay between social dynamics, local history, personal history, and environmental change. And when we're going through these are some of the questions that we tend to ask ourselves. Where is there evidence of social and societal change? Where are there evidence of people's values, evidence of people's priorities around things like policy relevance for things like adaptation and resilience to climate change? Where is there evidence of change in natural resources, evidence of links to ontology, the way that people live their lives and how that is being changed by climate change? And then overall, where can we see evidence of future hopes for the community? Beyond all of this, how can we understand all of these different questions as being intrinsically connected with one another and usually not cleanly built out in a way where we would be able to see each one being a question being answered, but instead as something that can be parsed out from somebody's personal history? You can go to the next slide. So as we're doing this, and especially as we're doing this as part of research projects about climate change, one of the things that we tend to emphasize is that this is an important way that people who are otherwise conducting physical science can ground that science in understanding the way that their work has direct connections to people in this place. And that as they are doing this work, they really should be considering the fact that this has these implications that are often going to be really challenging for people to accept. While they are doing this really intellectually stimulating work there are people who are experiencing these changes firsthand, who will not only find these things intellectually stimulating perhaps, but also may be challenged by the implications of them because they are not only intellectually challenging, but also emotionally challenging and potentially traumatic. Here's an interesting story from the archives that I found called Salty Apples that I think is a pretty good illustration of some of that. You can go to the next slide. As we are going through these archives, as we are thematically coding these, there are a lot of different unexpected ways that people's experience of climate change directly intersects with the history of that place and with people's personal values. And so only looking at it with a deductive code of let's look for evidence of environmental change misses these opportunities to look for themes that are really interesting and won't directly come from a climate science perspective. One of the really interesting ones here is the code of smell, which is a particular code that has come up in how people describe change, particularly after menhaden or small fish processing left the community. You can go to the next slide. And lastly, again, one of the reasons that we do this so often as part of research projects down east is so that scientists approach these projects with a degree of humility about the work that they are doing in a really complicated place. As people are going down there, using the oral history archives as a way of understanding the people who live there allows us to engage more responsibly with people there who are not only used to change, but are used to the types of change that directly implicate their lives and their well-being. Again, this helps us to better understand how to responsibly engage on terms that people are going to be more comfortable with on, again, an intellectually and emotionally challenging topic. You can go to the next slide. That just about does it for me. I highly encourage all of y'all to make use of this unbelievable set of resources there. It is an incredible way that we can look at a long arc of history as being a way of understanding people's perspectives of how change has occurred and then how they have adapted to it in the past. It's been an incredibly useful tool for us in engaging with people on the way that climate has always changed, and the people of Down East have always been resilient and adaptive to those changes. And that is the thing that will be needed now as well. I appreciate a little bit of y'all's time. Thank you to Karen, Tara, and Michelle for giving me a few minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
So it is 11 o'clock.
Patrick told me to tell everyone that the next session is getting pushed back 10 minutes for tech.
Okay.
No, figuring stuff out.
Do we have questions?
Yes,
Yay.
yes, exactly.
Okay, well, I'll get started. When you talk to the residents of Harkers Island about all these changes and you notice that the environmental changes aren't what they're really gathering, it's these other social changes that you're seeing and that you were talking about in some of these oral histories. Is there an element of scientific literacy that people like Max are trying to come in and show that that's part of it, or is that not part of the project? Trying to show that, yes, this is climate and it's not just a random event.
I'm gonna let Tara answer that, I think.
Yeah, so I think part of the project is to show that, scientific literacy shows up in lots of different ways, right? So the people of Down East living in this environment and adapting to this change always have been aware of tide changes, environmental changes for a long time, and that appears in the archives. So I think my answer to that question is yes, we want to show that there is some kind of scientific literacy, and Karen may have a lot more to add to this, I'm sure. But it is something that's always been there and is really intrinsically in the culture of people down east.
And my answer is, we know more than the scientist.
Absolutely.
You can write that down. Because our people are on the front lines, they've lived with it for generations, they've watched the inlets come and go, they've watched policy work and not work. And so my big message when I'm bringing these troopers in is we spend a good bit of time at the beginning of summer talking about you're treading on our ground now. You're talking about our waters. And I'm lucky that I've had scientists like Max and many others who I believe there is a turn in the marine science biology community that they want to be respectful of the people, because at long last we've realized that people are a part of that ecosystem. And so the ones that get as far enough as, to come to Harkers Island that I can trust, we don't need science heads going out and offending people when they've spent their life in that environment. And so building trust is absolutely the #1 job of a researcher, of an academic, of a writer, a researcher. They've got to prove themselves. We're not easily fooled. So is that true? I mean,
thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
How do you handle recruiting subjects for these projects? How does that happen for you guys?
I'm the gatekeeper.
But Karen also knows everyone. And there are a lot of people who are very willing to talk, and you'll see evidence of that in the oral history collection, in that you will have multiple conversations with the same person on many different topics.
And it's important for me, because I have to live with these people. They come and go. I have to live with them. I'm kin to most of them, and I get the kickback. So I have to make sure that whoever I'm sending somebody to is going to contribute to the conversation, not just moan and groan about fisheries policy or about the dingbatters moving in or whatever. So they don't have time to waste. We don't have time to waste. And so we have somewhat of an informal clearinghouse to make sure that what we get in the archive is valuable for the long haul and the short haul. So I've learned a lot in the process of being involved with oral history, because it does go down to trust.
You all had mentioned that there's an increasing population of people like moving in for retirement. How does that affect, like, do they affect in a positive or negative way your efforts to think about climate change and perhaps act on it in the research that you do? Like, are they like part of city council meetings, or are they supportive, or do they kind of, I don't know, are they not as concerned?
They're crazy.
Yeah.
They're coming in and building 3-story houses in marshes that were once ghost forest, but the county's permitting them. There's gonna be a spot on Spectrum TV, Spectrum News, the first week of hurricane season. And because they were down last week. So the relationship between the people from off and the people who belong there is very deep. And it's bridged on a case-by-case basis, and that takes time. Yeah, there's people who move there, they know everything, and they go to the meetings. And because they don't have anything else to do, it's really hard to get our people to the meetings because everybody's working 3 jobs, they're tending to the grandchildren, they're coaching a ball team, and they're teaching Sunday school. So I spend a lot of my time begging people to go to meetings, to be part of the conversation, because the local people are the ones who know what the history is, what the impacts are. They're putting kids on a school bus while the digbatters are riding around in Range Rovers. So the cultural divide is something that we have to navigate a lot, and it's very connected to the science and the history of that area with scientists.
I think I understand what ghost forests mean, but can you explain what a ghost forest is?
Ghost forests are spans of wooded areas that are now dying. I've got pictures on my phone because of saltwater intrusion. Under the ground is becoming more and more salt, and the trees are dying thousands of times. If you get anywhere on the east coast, on the coast of North Carolina, I have got people from Louisiana who were here 2 weeks ago, and they've got the same thing. It's just cypress trees. So any tree that is not tolerant to salt long term is dying. And the process, as I understand it, because I'm not a scientist, is as those trees fall, then that goes back to being a marsh. So is that right, Isabella? She's my intern this summer. So she, yeah, I mean, it's pretty overwhelming. It looks like a huge fire going through there.
I was interested, Michelle, in your part of the presentation, you mentioned that there were communities on Shackleford Banks before it becomes, state parks where it's, no lives there now.
Yeah.
What kind of records survive for the communities at Shackleford?
I'm going to ask for a little bit of help on this, but I'll do my best here. There's not a lot. There's, I think, a little bit of photo documentation in the state archives. They have photo documentation at the Core Sound Museum. There are oral histories of people who were born there. The National Park Service, I believe, has some, and I think they are making an effort to get more. I think that there is documentation just in looking at the changing landscape, because Shackleford Banks used to be connected to Cape Lookout. You could walk to it. And the fact that you can no longer walk between the two is really significant. I think some of the documentation is aided by interest in the wild horses. If anyone here has had a class with Carmine Prioli, you probably know about the wild horses. They've been there for a while, but the people were there longer or before them or with them. Karen, help me out.
Yeah, and in this month's Our State magazine, which I was thinking, what a contrast. Here we are at the university talking about Diamond City, and Ryan Stansel, who's a part of our whole network, his story about the Diamond City homecoming last August is in this month's Our State magazine, because there is a very real interest about that community was there. But on the cultural side, those of us whose grandparents and great-grandparents live there are still connected. We have a homecoming every 5 years. And that's been one of our key ways the museum has kept that story alive, because we all know what our grandmother told us. Grandmama told me about whales, but that's all I know. All there are sketches. There are very, very few photographs. There's some church records. I've got my grandmama's slat bonnet, bits and pieces like that, but the value there was just surviving. There was no luxury of anything fancy. They brought their homes across the side to Harkers Island and the Promised Land, so they didn't even leave their houses back there. They took them apart and rebuilt them on the mainland.
There are still grave markers there, correct?
Yes, there's 11 grave markers at Shackelford.
There was a store.
Oh, yeah, the store, church.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
it's really fascinating. Please join me in thanking them for this wonderful session. Thank you. Thank you, Max. All right, that's our time for this session, and
I think Max might have actually had his hand raised at one point.
Oh.
Max, did you say something there? Sorry.
Yes, but that's okay. I'm fine to hold my comments.
no, please.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna add, when we think about the like physical science piece, the coastal geomorphology, like these islands were always walking islands. They were always meant to move. The geology and the geography of this place is constantly changing. And when we think about the paired human and coastal history of this place, it becomes even more important to document how these changes are occurring, because without people putting their stuff down on these islands and saying, now this island actually has to stay where it is because my house and my car are here, we have decided that these islands now stay where they are. When we think about a place like Shackelford Banks and the history of the horses there, you can hear in the oral histories some of the stuff about how the islands are so low that even just a little bit of extra elevation means that plants can grow there. One of the oral histories is regarding how some of these stacks of plants still exist out on a place like Shackelford, and it is because of the bodies of dead horses that have died on beaches and now provide just enough elevation and nutrients that you can find plants on there. So this type of like evidence, this type of information is like an incredibly important piece of the context for understanding the paired ecological, environmental, and social history of this place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max.
He's at New Zealand.
Thank you all for joining us this session. Appreciate it.
Be glad to talk to anybody who's interested. Thank you, Michelle.
I gotta figure out how to stop it.
It's a village.
I like the.
And a couple of technicians.
Yeah.